assume that, sorry, I'm just trying to navigate technology. One would have to assume that all of the normal proportions about health, matching, blood types, etc., will be followed. That all the normal medical proportions. The sting in the tail question, I think, to this, aside from what it does to my spine and my thinking about ethics, is the question that I'm not clear about this in the state of Massachusetts, but in some US states, if the shoe were on the other foot, namely if a person is in prison and needs an organ transplant, the fact of being in prison precludes them from being able to access an organ transplant.
Because they're not allowed in this country to get sent.
They're also not allowed a whole lot of other things in this country, like they can vote. And then one of the really curly ones is, let's imagine a prisoner has access to an organ transplant should they need it. What if that prisoner is on death row? Should they still have access to an organ transplant?
What a waste of an organ.
Is it?
So precious.
He didn't tell you that the person on death row was going to take his whole body.
But not forgetting that there are people on death row who live there for 20 or 30 years, and not forgetting that there are people on death row who are later found to be not guilty. Is it still a waste?
Do they have the death penalty in the state of Massachusetts?
I'm not sure. I haven't dug to that level of depth. I don't think they do, but I'm not.
I don't think they do.
So is it still a waste?
There's two questions. There's the real question of what's happening in Massachusetts, and then there's a whole lot of hypothetical questions that follow around.
Yep.
And I would prefer to give an answer to the real question. Maybe to the hypothetical. Sorry, I will replace that. I would find it easier to give an answer to the real question than the answer to the hypothetical.
Which probably is a really neat segue into tonight, because we're going to be dealing with that nexus between what, let's just call it hypothetical and real. We have to find a way of bringing these together. You can't have a theory in thin air and not apply it. And you can't apply thinking without some theory or structure to help us apply it. Otherwise, our thinking is just fluffy.
And also, then it sets a precedent.
There's precedence there. There is, and we may come across later, there is this thing called situation ethics that looks at every situation. One of my criticisms of situation ethics is it runs the risk of getting lost in a situation without solid principles, if you're not careful, to apply to situations more generally. So a lot of tonight we're going to spend looking at principles. Let's see how we go. I'm hoping, I know Wendy has, because we've just been talking about it before we all came. I did say I was raising it. Have you all seen the trolley problem? One or two have. Okay. It's an age-old one, and once we get to the end, I'll tell you why it's so important. This is a problem that I encountered when I first started learning ethics, and the problem goes fundamentally like this. There is a runaway trolley, train, whatever. It's on a set of tracks. It is going downhill at a fast speed, and the speed is increasing. There are 5 workers working on the track. You are standing at the junction. You have the power to pull the lever or not pull the lever. You can divert the train and save these 5 workers' lives. However, if you divert the train, there is an innocent child who has just wandered to and playing on the diversion track who will be killed if you divert the train. Do you or do you not divert the train? What are you going to do and why?
I'd ask myself, what is the greatest good? Still might not tell me whether the child should die, but at least it would be a start to think about it.
So what is the greatest good in this case?
We can come back to the medical situation to save lives.
Be nice, but that's not available to you.
Is the child fine?
Does it matter?
Well, a situation that's not too close to me personally, but not a million miles away. There's a French equivalent of Private Eye, the name of which escapes me, which puts up some cartoons lampooning Muhammad, and some Islamic terrorists came to that office and demanded to be let in. And a person let them in. The threat was, let me in or I'll kill your child. And they let them in. I think that's a more or less accurate. But it was in
Okay,
the
but
same building.
in this instance, I'm asking us, I'm just saying, let's put it hypothetically out there. And your problem is, one of the problems is you've already run out of time. Generally, if a train's going down at that kind of speed down the hill, you've got maybe 10 or 20 seconds to make up your mind. But let's elongate those seconds. What are you going to do?
I think there's more chance of the adults being able to react to it and make a decision than a child.
But I've simplified it by saying either way they will die.
How do you measure a life before when you're trying to knock down, say, 5 men and 1 child? One child. How do we
we
think
measure?
about the value of the life? In ages, in families, you've got 5 workers taking income.
But a child, you don't know what's going to happen to that child if you save the child. The child might grow up to be a genius and this like that.
Mhm.
Or you could read it this way, because there's that. You just don't know.
This is not a unique question about the trouble. People in wartime, commanders and things, face this type of dilemma all the time.
Yes.
Do I save this group or let that one go? So I don't think it's a unique question.
I'm not suggesting it's unique.
Sorry. But you switch the situation to the wartime context, you will nearly always find that the group is what is saved because that has the greatest value to the society.
Okay.
So if I'm deciding on the trolley, I want to benefit society.
So what if there are 5 workers? You have the choice, and there are now 3 children on the track.
There's no right way around that.
It's not just 5 workers. There's their relationships and other connections. It's a community, a society versus 3 people who haven't yet embarked on becoming a major part. That's the part.
We don't know whether we've got families and children. It's fine.
Big chance of some of them.
Yes. That's why I'd probably choose the 501. and break my heart at the same time.
Yeah.
You go down and hear it, it's great. It's two kids, I'm asking you to pull the lever.
There is another picture we'll come back to, but what if now, next to you, and you're standing just near the track, you've got the lever available, and next to you is a very obese person. And you know that just a push onto the track will stop the train.
Oh,
Well, you're late to get on the train, is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying this person is fat enough, you know, I'm building a picture to derail the train.
And that's your aim, is to do
Well, the five wouldn't be killed, the train wouldn't get as near as the five.
all the charts. All
There's
the
a
charts.
difference here. The difference is, if you push the person in, you are committing
An action.
an action, whereas your action in the other thing is determined by the best good.
Keep going.
Okay.
So everything's committing a positive action as opposed to letting things determine themselves.
Okay, but you're still at the lever, you're still making a choice about the lever.
But your action is with the lever.
Mhm.
You are predetermined. What if the trolley was able to stop in time?
Mhm.
You don't know that.
Okay, I'm just building into the problem it won't.
Or
I'm keeping it simple. Because we can complicate it in a number of ways. What if,
you choose not to? Are you still?
okay, and there's, I think, one of our conundrums, that this is fundamentally about, do I choose to do something knowing that whatever I do is going to create a harm, or do nothing and pretend to myself, to others, I'm all innocent because I did nothing. The trolley was going down there anyway, and 5 people died.
Push that person off the track.
In that instance. Now, what if I told you this fat person has cancer and will probably die in the next 6 months anyway? Is that going to make a difference to your decision?
You could ask him to volunteer.
Yeah,
He could throw himself.
yeah. You could ask him to throw himself on the track.
this new Northern
It's a big word. It's.
So,
I think I would find it easy not to directly commit a crime, but to leave to risk and circumstances the outcome. I wouldn't push the person into the trap, and I would, like the wartime commander, say,
so you would go by numbers game.
essentially, yes, but you're giving it a harsh name, I would say, for the good of society.
So if we had 3 young children under the age of 5 on one side of the track, and our 5 workers are all, let's say, comfortably at or somewhat above retirement age. In other words, they're in the old, my kind of older age group. Is that going to make a difference to your decision?
But
Wow.
you couldn't possibly know that. If you're in that situation, you couldn't possibly have those facts. So it's not only hypothetical, it's hyper-hypothetical.
Yep.
So,
And it's there for a reason.
so
They don't know what to start.
you're making it too difficult.
So you're going to walk away because it's too hard.
We could ask ourselves what the law would say in these circumstances. The law might give us some guidance. as to how to respond. I'm not too certain what the law is on it, because it certainly, I believe.
We come down to a judgment of somebody
Yeah,
Being responsible.
saying, okay, this is what you did right, and this is what you did wrong.
yeah,
Somebody is going to have to make that decision where, you know, suppose you save the 5 people,
yeah.
but someone says, oh, well, you should have saved children, then a judge or somebody is going to have to sit back and think that over again and decide whether what you did was correct or not.
Mm.
But don't worry, there will be counter lawsuits. Why did the parents allow the children on the track on the main lines? You know,
Well, what if the child just happened to get through a gap in the fence or a?
there'll be another lawsuit. You know, so-
Seriously.
Yeah, okay.
Risk case law.
But my point is the law is not going to solve the ethical question. The law may solve the legal questions. And you've correctly named, and there are a number of difficulties. There's the whole question of, for example, what actually is a life? And what's a life worth? And if you ask a doctor or an actuary, they'll give you very different kinds of answers about what a life is worth. If you ask an insurance expert, they'll put a number on it. You know, given your age, your working life, etc., they can tell you in dollars how many what your life is worth. That's not the value of a life. That's a particular financial calculation.
So what's the answer?
My point is, let me just spend a little bit of time getting there. I think correctly, you've said that it's always going to be a complex situation and it's going to involve emotions as well as thought process. And we're going to want to ask how close or distant are we to any of these people, because that influences our thinking, even though we know it shouldn't technically, it does. Fundamentally, it's the question of, do I do something or do I do nothing? It's the example, as I said, it's one example that I was introduced to when I first started studying ethics. It's in a kind of opening lecture example that lots of lecturers use, and they will morph it in a whole variety of ways. And for many years, I thought it was a very nice, fanciful example, and you know, maybe in wartime or maybe in some extreme circumstances, people might think about this. Until I came back to it, preparing for a course similar to this one, and sat and thought about it for a while, because this is exactly what the people designing autonomous driving vehicles are having to think their way through. This is a real life problem. This is not a fanciful, made up. I've actually sat around the table with people who are involved in maps for autonomous vehicles, who are puzzling about how much detail the government needs to put on our maps of cities in order to give access to vehicle manufacturers, in order that these vehicles can one day drive safely into our streets. Somebody who's designing the systems for these vehicles is having to make exactly the decisions that we've just thought about. There is a something that happens. It doesn't matter what the happens is. And something happens and the vehicle has to go either left or right, and it has to hit somebody. It'll kill or injure somebody. Who and how do you decide?
But you know, notionally that system development will have to be numbers. Perhaps it will be able to, you know, 5 men and 1 small child. Will that even go right? They're not that sophisticated.
Are we prepared to trust something where a machine is making those decisions as opposed to a human being?
No.
That's not.
And that's exactly where we're headed with those with that stuff.
Ask the millennials.
It needs statistics as to how often people are killed in, the pedestrians are killed in cars being driven by drivers.
Mhm.
You know, there must be some sort of means of comparing.
Yep.
And
So,
that might make a difference.
okay, so we could potentially do that. And what we could do is we could get the statistics for how many pedestrian injuries and deaths there are in a year. And then we can set a whole lot of autonomous vehicles going around the city. And we can track them for, say, a year, 2 years, 3 years, and see how many deaths there are or injuries, and whether it's greater or less. Are we prepared to do that? It's a kind of a real world experiment.
The problem is it's going to take a certain amount of time. Are the manufacturers willing to not proceed to allow those statistics to be right?
We do these real world experiments all the time. With something as simple as software, put out the program and let you find all the states that have to correct it. Or a Boeing puts out an aircraft that is safe despite the certification, and the mistakes are made and hopefully they're rectified in the new one. So I think we are actually making those kinds of decisions now.
You sacrifice animals.
Yeah, put the animal bit aside. I think there are a whole lot of issues here that are complicated. And those who are in the process of manufacturing autonomous vehicles will tell you that there are a number of vehicles on the roads today that could drive autonomously if you let them. The vehicle manufacturers, however, have agreed it's going to take probably another 20 years before they can allow those vehicles to drive autonomously because of these problems.
And do they use the word ethical problems?
They talk about this as legal problems. So my brother, my youngest brother lives in Germany. He has a very nice car. He, what's it, about 4 years ago or so, 4 or 5 years ago when I last visited him there, because we've had this lovely long break of not being able to travel. And he was talking about sitting in his car in the driver's seat. He's the only person who drives it to work every morning, doing his emails. Because the car will drive itself. It will brake, it will keep in the lanes, it will do everything it needs to in the traffic. And all he has to do is the broad direction and it'll get him to work.
Like a sat nav, you said, I want to go next to the city.
He's still got to do the left right turning. But all the other basic stuff in the traffic, the car will do.
And mistakes and that, we don't do that.
Yep. So he sits there and does his emails on the way to work.
Get it right and
You better not pick up his mobile phone.
I don't know what the laws are in Germany, and I'm not going down that track. But what I'm raising here is it makes us think about a range of problems. What's right? What's good? What's the value of a life? What's a greater or lesser good, greater or lesser evil? How do we make these decisions? And it's one of those wonderful ones that's, you know, a nicely worn old example, and you'll find it often in the textbooks, where it just dawned on me that it's actually so relevant.
There are certainly trains in many airports in the world. If you're going from one terminal to another, you're in a train that is driverless.
Yeah.
But there are, I think, I don't know where, but I think there are underground systems where there are.
Singapore, for example, has a lot
Singapore
of
is
the airport in Dubai has trains, they're all driverless.
Los Angeles,
Yeah, they're all done, but
so we're one step away.
But there's no, the driverless trucks that they got, they're not in the mining.
Yep.
sites,
Yeah,
trains,
WA mine
yeah,
sites
trains,
commonly use
yeah,
driverless
yeah.
trucks.
It's the driving instructors.
Well, we're going to get a lot of experience
Instructors in an office.
by these exceptional circumstances. Like just getting the car to park itself or to come forward because it's tight, is all adding to our knowledge of the expectations. You know, in the first mining site, driverless truck crashes into a building or something with people in it, there's going to be a whole lot of questions on it.
And one of the questions that we ask in advance is, what's the risk we're prepared to take? How far are we prepared to allow things to go? How many risks are we prepared to take of people being injured, killed, or whatever?
What is society's expectation?
Yeah.
The RIC.
I don't know if they hit someone or not, but theirs was going peculiarly slowly.
Yeah.
So, you know, they have thought about risks to, yeah, it's too old now.
We've got an answer in the mining industry in that we know that there have been X number of incidents, driving incidents. And so we have a body of knowledge that's the kill from leaving it where it is. You've then got your experimental situation, and you will have a baseline from which to get to say, well, this is the better for society.
So is death and injury the only reason we should be making those decisions?
Good
It's a good
start.
start.
Yeah.
What about
Yeah,
people's
yeah, what's
jobs?
the value of life?
So we're asking about value of life. I'm now asking, what's the value of a person having meaningful work? So if, let's imagine a mine site has to have 100 people on rotation so that they get a year's worth of people driving trucks, which is meaningful work for some people, compared to half a dozen people sitting in Perth in front of a big computer screen or set of screens, managing driverless trucks. Is either one more or less meaningful?
Well, we face that in our supermarkets today where, you know, one checkout has a person, but you're encouraged to go to the bank of 8 or 10 and do it yourself.
Yep.
And I always make the decision, if at all possible, to go to that person and say, how are you?
And it's the same with the banks, banking industry, the closing banks down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, a lot of agencies, I work with them,
And if you've been, if you've been following the news around things like ChatGPT and various other technologies, automation in technology is about to take a gargantuan leap of a kind that I'm not sure we've factored into our imaginations yet.
We want to talk about worldwide having people get an income.
There is one or two of the Scandinavian countries do that. It's called a something, I'm not sure, but everybody in society gets a certain base, yeah, could be Finland. Everybody gets a certain baseline income regardless of whether you are work in employment or not.
What we're coming up to in our circumstantial example is that everything comes in a context. And that context in that mining industry example is that we're going to start processing these minerals in some way here. And 100 people who lost their driver's jobs are going to have an opportunity to move into an expanded area because
In a few years' time.
the technology expands other options. So I wouldn't like to make the decision just on the basis of people losing their job in that work. I would want to ask myself, what else is happening? And how much good is coming out of that for society?
That would happen, you know, from carts and horses.
Yeah.
It's cars.
It does, it just takes an awfully long time.
It's perhaps comparing apples with oranges here, but I reckon that the general consensus will be, let's go for it. Because nobody's worried too much about the gun industry and how sophisticated and how monstrous that has proved to be in the United States.
Okay, we'll come back to guns next week. If we're done.
Sorry, bit of a hobby horse.
Let me move along because I do need to have half an hour of time. So for those of you who weren't here last week, these sessions are fairly interactive. We did set some rules around that. I find that pretty open-ended. We will try and have a break around about half time for 10 minutes to allow you to have a toilet break, cup or whatever. If anybody gets desperate for a break, please call some time out. We can all start to have a break together. I will be going a little bit over time on each of the evenings because my commitment is for a certain number of hours, and in order to make up the hours like that, because we've only got more limited number of sessions together, it's just the way the diary worked out. If you have any questions, ask away. I just want you to think for a moment. We have again, nuclear submarines in the news, not foreign, but in this case, I'm playing. We have a rogue nuclear submarine. It's out at sea and the crew have lost control. An automated missile is about to be launched. You are at base and can choose to destroy the submarine. Okay, you'll get it. This is a variation on the trolley problem in its own little way. But I'm now making it.
Red October.
Yeah, I did watch that movie and enjoy it. But I'm now making this, rather than my local trolley going down the local street, I'm making this, and something that's somewhere internationally. What I'd like to do is, I didn't even unwrap these, shoot around some of these. Can I get you to take a few? And what I'd like you to do is spend just a couple of minutes writing down your questions, one question per sticky note. So you'll need a little bundle and I've got some spares if you need more.
Sorry, was we running down?
What are your questions? So in the same way as about the trolley problem, we started asking, do I kill one? Do I kill five? You know, what's better, what's worse? We asked, what's a life worth? Based on this, what are your questions? They don't have to be world shattering. I just want to know if you know, they don't have to be the best question out. I just want to know what your questions are. You might want questions about, I need to know more detail. You might want to know something, you might want to prod something. You might, I won't give you 2 minutes. Why these don't think so sticky when I need them not to stick. Don't stick when I need them. Do you think we've just about worn out all those immediate questions, or are we still going? That's it, okay. 3 questions there, just hang on to them. 20 of them. It's again, it's part of it, do something, do nothing question. And one of the questions from me is, if I do something, does that make me responsible in a way that doing nothing did not? Because we talk about people being responsible for their actions. So if I did nothing, would I be less responsible than doing something? We'll get there. So we'll come back to our questions. I want to introduce you to Socrates and Plato, particularly to Plato in this instance. And I will apologize to my friend David Dockrell, who first taught me about Plato and so on, and spent a whole semester teaching Plato and Socrates, and I'm about to destroy it inside 5 minutes. So I apologize too. Plato, Socrates, etc., particularly Plato, was a key thinker. Plato, we're talking about roughly 428 to 348 BCE. So pre-Christian in that sense, but he's important because he's the first systematic writer about ethics. So I said last week we've had ethics and ethical thinking going way back into the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Mesopotamians. We've got it through the Old Testament, but Plato is the first one who systematically writes about it. In his Euthyphro, he tells this story. He likes telling stories. It's a conversation between God and the philosopher. God asks, "Why do you always ignore me?" The philosopher thinks a while and then responds, "I must ask you some questions first. You command us to do what is good, but is it good because you command it, or do you command it because it is good?" If that, is it good because you command it, or is it, or do you command it because it's good before you commanded it? So God has a thing. And God replies, "Surely it's good because I command it." "Ah," the philosopher responds, "I'm not so sure. If good is only good because you say it is, then you could make anything good. You could make it good that torturing infants is good, but surely that's absurd." "Agreed," said God. "I tested you and you made me pleased. Now, what was your other choice?" The philosopher says, You chose what is good because it is good. But that shows that goodness does not depend entirely on you at all. God says, even so, I've produced some pretty good books on the subject. Is this not a dilemma? Plato picks up beautifully. Is it good because God makes it good, or is it good anyway and God calls it good? Plato is wrestling with our beliefs and our assumptions. And a whole
God saying that the light is silver was good.
is it good because God says it's good? Or is it good because God makes it good? In that sense, maybe.
Yeah.
So Plato would agree with us that the ultimate aim of the moral life is human well-being, happiness, goodness in life, whatever these things might be. He believes that we lead a good life because we practice virtues like honesty and truth and humbleness and a whole range of things. And these are learned like life skills. So Plato would say you get what today we might call a life coach. He wants everybody to have a philosopher as a mentor, and you learn and practice these skills, and they're important to learn and practice. And he makes the assumption that we have a stable society, that there is good public order and governance, and that ultimately our happiness is a reflection of the cosmic happiness of what Plato might call the gods in general terms. Talking about pre-Christian thinking in a way. But the goal is both the good life and the harmonious soul. And there's an awful lot of Plato that rings very close to early Christian thought. And you hear it kind of echoed. So for Plato, you might say ethics is the glue that holds our society together. It's about our beliefs and our values and so on. And Plato would say society comes before the individual, and he has this lovely quote somewhere that God is the measure of all things. Plato loves playing with stories and exposes through them the flaws and inconsistencies in the thinking of the day. He wants to lead us to clearer thinking. So that God story, if you sit and think about it, is actually really a mind bender. It's one I suggest you go back to and just ponder over. Is it good because God makes it good? Or is it good anyway and God just calls it good? It goes to the heart of who or what we think God is and what God's power is or isn't. And whether or not God created goodness or not. If God didn't create goodness, then there's something that God didn't create. Could it be both? And Plato's wrestling with these questions. How do we know what is? What leads to a good life? What is knowledge and so on? Anyone seen the TV series, The Good Life? No? You've absorbed Plato. It's based on a whole lot of, it's a wonderful watch if you haven't seen it. It does the rounds of Netflix and all other good.
Is this the really old English series that you're talking about?
No, The Good Life is not that old. I think it's American.
Ah.
It's called The Good Life. Life. It's based on the premise of a young lady who dies and goes to heaven. In other words, the afterlife, and then lots of things happen. It's straight out of the Plato playbook, or at least the first series is. So if you want to learn something without them mentioning the word Plato or philosophy or anything complex, you're going to learn something about this stuff. The Good Life is actually a really interesting watch. And if you step back and think about some of it, it's quite mind-bending.
Netflix.
Well, or Stan, or you'll find it on YouTube,
It's
or
actually on one of the, is it on YouTube?
yeah, you can pick it. Probably, I don't know. It's all
Is it a single movie or is it a series?
it's a series, and but you can watch them a bit out of context. You know, and there are ones on all kinds of things. My point in the background is Plato remains relevant. He's a very rigorous thinker, and he's up for a good discussion. So I want to come back to, because Plato gets us to ask questions, to the questions you asked. And I want to suggest that they could work a little bit like this. That there are two different levels, if you like, of questions. There are questions based on the text, and there are intellectual questions. So a question based on the text, I would be looking at the text about the submarine and saying, what does this mean? What does it, you know, can I ask, a bit like the comprehension questions you asked at school. There are the intellectual questions that are a bit like we were asking earlier, what is the value of a life? What is goodness? What is, you know, the more abstract? Then there are closed and open questions. So a closed question has an established answer. What is your name? What year were you born in? You know, do you own a car? And the ultimate closed questions are ones to which you can answer yes or no to. So they have an answer, either a yes or no, a factual answer or something. And then there are open questions that have no established answer. Is it right to fire or not fire a missile? Is it ever okay to? And often those are the questions that engage us with, is it right to, is it okay to, is it, they're the questions that often engage us with ethics or with abstract thinking. Not always, but often. Now, take it a step further. Is that okay to absorb, or do you, right? Same thing. I've just pinched a freaking nice slide because it was a freaking nice slide. Right? Quadrant 1, comprehension questions. The answer is in the text. If you look at the text, you'll find the answer. That's what we all did at school in English and those sorts of things. Quadrant 2, speculative or imaginary questions. What if, you know, what if I could get the submarine to be not out of control? What if I had a secret way of communicating with, you know, what can Harry Potter, familiar, is built that I mean, the story is brilliant, I think, because it's full of ancient Greek mythology and German literature and French literature and things, but it's based on speculation. What if? Can we imagine? So, and then back to quadrant 3, back to our closed questions, the factual knowledge questions. The answer exists somewhere. I can do some investigation, I can Google it, I can, you know, what type of submarine is this? If I know what type of submarine I might, you know, there's an answer somewhere. And there's philosophical or inquiry questions that have no established answer. The question is entirely independent of the text, and it might lead to a lot more questions and a lot of thinking, like what's the value of human life? So let me apply this to one example of a story that you would all know of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Everybody know Goldilocks? Yeah, okay, just checking. I have come across a class where not everyone knew it. So a comprehension question might be, how many bowls of porridge were there on the table? Agree?
Yeah.
If we go to the factual knowledge questions, we might say something like, what type of bears live in that forest? If we go to the imaginary or speculative questions, what might have happened if Goldilocks had not entered the house? And if we go to the philosophical or inquiry questions, is it ever right to enter someone's home, eat their food and sleep in their beds without permission? You can see though that they are different types or different kinds of questions, that they're not right or wrong questions. They're different kinds of questions. There's the fairly, I shouldn't call them mundane, but the routine questions about how many bowls of porridge, what type of bears, and we can find answers to those fairly simply. We tend to ask those a lot in life. And then there's the other side, the speculative, what if things were different? And the even more kind of abstract is there a right or wrong, can we push the thinking here? Like really push it. Now, if I can do that with Goldilocks and the Three Bears, imagine what I can do with the submarines. And would you believe I haven't even put any questions there, because here is one I've prepared earlier. And hence your sticky notes. What I'd like you to do, without too much personal argy-bargy, is think about where your questions about the nuclear submarine belong, and come and kind of park them in the quadrant you think they belong into. And because you've got several questions, they may belong into different quadrants. That's okay. They may all belong into one, and we can later change our minds. That's all right too. That's okay. Have a guess. I'm kind of fast tracking this a bit because I've got half an hour on the clock. I thought you needed some mid-class exercise.
Not quite so easy as you
No,
think.
No, it's not as easy as you think. Some of it. So, and again, it's a bit difficult because I'd love to have an hour or so to spend on just unpacking this, but you just asked in a short interval like this. It's a bit like apologising today when I make a mockery of later often having taught it to me for a semester. All I'm trying to do, as I said last time, is give you one big lick of a huge ice cream and hope it tastes good.
Philosophical background.
Okay. So we've got some comprehension questions about where is the submarine, what's the size of the crew, how long have I got to make a decision, Can I fix a technical problem? Where's the missile going? Where's the missile going actually is probably not a comprehension question per se, because it's not in the text. It might be a facts question. I would tend to park it there. And we could take a question like that and go speculation. You know, let's imagine the missile is going and it's just going to pop in the sea. Well, let's imagine the missile is going to fall on North Korea or Russia or, you know, the middle of Tokyo or Perth or anywhere else. What if?
Yes.
And would so a whole lot of questions there. Question about, you know, how are we going to destroy the submarine? Why is the missile being launched? How many lives will perish? Again, the size of the armament on board, you know, what else, what other consequences, its vicinity to land, other actions that might be permissible, where will the missile hit? Why is the submarine there? Etc. And this is the stuff we're really good at asking. This is the stuff I'm most interested in. Speculation. What do I really need to know? What damage is expected if I don't do anything? You know, or we could maybe park that down there a bit. What if I don't do anything? What if I choose to be really restricted? Will the missile be certain to hit its target? Yeah, there could be speculation, that could be factual, we could go either way. What are the consequences if I act for me? What responsibilities do I wear? Can the missile itself be hit and destroyed? There's one I haven't thought about. Is Trump on board the submarine? Okay, I'll pay that.
I think that's a series of questions which really says, I do not want to make this decision.
It could do, or I want to tell a story about it, or people who are authors spend a lot of time in that space, hence my Harry Potter example, speculating about what ifs.
Scenarios.
Yeah. This is where ethics occurs. So let's see what we've got here. What is my responsibility in this situation? Why has the situation come about? Let's pray. Okay, maybe. But that's probably not it's not a question. What day of the week is it?
That was avoiding the situation.
That's an avoidance question. I put that up there somewhere. Could other vessels in the location be at risk? Yep. Okay, so that might be a little bit more speculation. But if we start listening to the language, this is kind of the what is, who is, how is, and this starts getting into the why, what for, consequences, those kinds of, so then when you hear the language of questions, there's different language that occurs. What, how, you know, how tall, how much, how far, how many, all that, are that sort of facts comprehension stuff. Speculation inquiry tends to go to why, what if, different language. So let me introduce you to Aristotle. This was semester 2 from David. Again, he's an early philosopher. He lives around about the same time as Plato, roughly 384 to 322 BCE. And he underlines and develops the idea that doing good, living a good life, is based on principles. That you can't make different decisions in different situations. You have to have guiding principles that come from somewhere and that are sufficiently generalizable, but allow for exceptions that you can actually apply them and use them. And he thinks a lot about principles in political and public life. He thinks a lot about the virtues or living a virtuous life. And again, he believes that these principles or virtues are skills that can be learned, like habits. We learn them, we get good at them. We need a tutor, but we need strong reasoning. And Aristotle adds on top of reasoning the notion of wisdom. And it's so the early Greeks around Plato, Socrates and so on have this sense of reasoning, and Aristotle comes and adds the notion of wisdom and say, yes, but to take this reasoning through to fruition, you need to be wise. And he talks about consistency. So if we go through to reasoning, principles, wisdom, back to our nuclear submarine, what core principles do you think underpin the questions that we've been asking?
Nice again.
What are the principles or core ideas that underpin the questions we asked about the submarine?
Well, in the end, what we're asking is, what is a life worth how many lives?
Gracious God for the gracious number.
What harm and how much?
Mhm.
When we ask you that question, because we want a clarity which the Aristotle and Plato would bring in the realm of God.
Good versus evil.
Yep.
Because who is in the suffering? Are they good or
Mhm.
bad?
So that begins the kind of zone to point at some of the principles or core ideas. And then we have to ask, along with Aristotle, are they generalizable? So can we always ask questions about good versus evil? Yep, but we can't always ask the question in every situation, are they the baddies? Because not every situation has baddies and goodies. Can we always ask the question about what's the value of a human life? Yes, we can. How do we apply that? That gets really complex.
What if I'm a member of nuclear disarmament and have a framework which makes me look at the submarine in a very narrow railroad box?
Go on.
I would have no compulsion to destroy the submarine because it's in my perception evil.
Okay, but what if,
Even without firing a missile?
to ask the speculative question then, what if destroying the nuclear submarine itself causes a nuclear catastrophe?
Need to know that in advance.
Maybe you don't.
Then it wasn't my intention, sorry. What else
So-
can I do?
So it is the notion of intention. So it wasn't my intention to do it. Is that a defense? Is it a sufficient
That's
defense?
not always a legal defense.
No. And Otto von Neurath wrote the book on intention, and it's quite a big book.
I, in that sense, I took that action in all innocence because I did not have the wisdom or knowledge that was needed to try and balance that out.
So you didn't think about asking the expert?
You know, I have time.
I didn't say what time you did or didn't have. I just said something was that. You said, and this is one of the, I mean, these principles are really interesting, and that one in particular comes up all the time in discussions like COVID and vaccinations and so on, of do we actually bother to turn around and ask and listen to the experts? And the interesting data in Australia apparently is the more middle class or well-to-do you are in terms of your general well-being and the place you live, the less likely you are to turn around and ask the experts. And the more likely you are to depend on fluffy information off the internet.
I thought it would have been reversed.
So did I.
Yes, so-
And it's a bit of research that's come out in the last few days that's shown actually what I thought is probably wrong. I think if you dig underneath it, there are some deeper reasons why. And the deeper reasons are actually not about trusting the experts, but because if you go into really little country remote areas, there are so few experts, and the experts are fly in, fly out like nurses and doctors. They come once, you get one shot, one opportunity, so people go. Whereas in cities, you can take your time and you have more opportunities and people don't just immediately jump back. So I think there are some other tensions. It's not as simplistic as that.
Surely too, it's so political.
But my point is, if we go to the principle of trust the experts, often we actually don't.
In a society that challenges the experts, like I'm the middle class and I'm hearing powerful voices pushed at me all the time, challenging the experts.
So nothing wrong with that. But I'm just trying to unpack that question a bit.
Tea time?
That's what I'm thinking. So,
And Bex,
so let's have a 10-minute break. And then we'll move on to my friend and yours, Thomas Aquinas.
Oh, great.
Oh, we skipped him. He didn't have much to say about nuclear submarines.
Nobody talked about this.
Yes. And I'm hoping that you guys will bring some of this back. I mean, I can only do skimming across the surface of the centuries. Not that I'm aware of. And I'm not aware of much.
Last time people talk about themselves,
Yeah.
it was difficult listening to the Zoom. I could hear you beautifully, but not the other screen.
As you can see, it's hard, but these classes work only because of the discussion.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, I'm a St George's member, so I've seen you
Right, yeah.
at St George's
Yep.
periodically.
Yeah.
And
They haven't invited me back for a long time, so.
oh, well, I have no authority here whatsoever.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I was a palliative care nurse, so you can see that.
Yeah, and you'll see, you know, coming in some of the
Yes.
discussions that I've also had to stand at the foot of hospital beds and, you know, do we leave the machine on? And when you're standing in front of the bottom and social work. It is.
Or else you absolutely just doesn't.
Realistic.
No, it's all changed.
You have had gone through experiences all like this, wouldn't you? Oh, yes. It's not hard, so. We all go through the day. Unfortunately, I was free, so by the time you try to make it see the child. Yes, I'm sorry.
You wonder how we ever make it through the day if we have all the ethical questions. But obviously we do.
You do, yeah.
But we must make decisions all the time.
Decisions. What leads to a certain decision? It's very. And sometimes it's a make decisions based on consequences rather than principles.
I've got a sensor. And I know I shouldn't do that piece of cake. And then I confirm it later on. And I don't feel guilty somehow or something. I enjoy the cake.
Well, it's good that you enjoyed it anyway.
Yes, but I promise myself next time, I will just look at it. Because I know the peak.
I did the same, except it's not distance. Yes.
I wonder how far the church is strayed from. Lots of decisions being made in recent times. The church is different as an outcome of the decisions. It's good, maybe bad. Building the nuclear submarine. What happened? Building the nuclear submarine?
I wanted to know what nationality they were, because I could see the consequences of, you know, it's the
belongs to the United States of America, or it belongs to Russians, or it belongs to the Chinese, or it belongs to the French. You know, could give that markedly different outcome there.
Yeah, I mean, you could say sorry for free, but I don't think the Chinese would believe it. If you made a mistake. Comes down.
All based on economics.
No, that's too cynical.
I think that's the problem, is we've all become too wealthy and as a result.
Well, I guess look in your own family circumstances. Is every decision an economic decision?
No, but I can see it more
It
and
might
more.
have economic consequences.
Yes.
Yeah. The society has.
Society. It's all about money.
The group of us here have nothing in common, but we believe in God. Not all society lives that way.
Or the same. This topic. How finding accountability through our approach to this topic individually. I'd have to become very legalistic. If that was the only part of the only. What about our belief in God? Affection, perceptions.
I would hope deeply. I'd be worried if it didn't.
Yeah, that's a lot of.
All right, we all conquered the non-functioning coffee machine and tried to get tea out of it. One more to come.
Still battling the machine.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was a great discussion. Okay. We try and keep people on their toes. So I'm moving. Yes, I know I've moved past St. Paul and past Jesus and past all those. And this is what I said deliberately last time in my introductory comments. Commonly, in a theological setting, these kinds of courses are taught by opening the New Testament, get out Beatitudes, or we open the Old Testament and get out whatever it might be, and off we go. And I'm deliberately trying to be a bit different and provocative, because I'm making the assumption that you can read the Bible for yourselves. And I'm making the assumption that in all that wider stuff that you might be doing theologically, that ultimately you get back to the biblical stuff. We will get back to it and touch base with it a few times, and you're of course very welcome to bring it into the conversation. But I'm trying to bring into the story thinkers you might not be as familiar with, people you may or may not have heard about, and ideas that might not be as fluent for you. So here is our friend Thomas Aquinas.
Can I just ask if that's a painting of what might have been him?
It's a photograph of a painting. That is probably him, or may have been him, I don't know. I got it off the internet. I searched for pretty pictures of Thomas Aquinas and found one I liked.
Was there any similarity between them?
Pardon?
Was there any similarity between
Yeah.
images?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
There often is. Yeah, I think with a lot of these people, we can make assumptions that there were paintings painted in their lifetime and that we know at least somewhat what they look like. We're talking now about the years 1225 to 1274. Is when Aquinas lived. So we're coming out of the Middle Ages into the Enlightenment. We have a theologian who is probably one of the most prolific theological writers who ever lived. Aquinas' Summa Theologica. If you've ever seen it on a library bookshop, I think I've been stretching to get my arms around the volumes. And that's his summary of theology before he goes in depth. He left an enormous amount of material. So again, the 5-minute summary with apologies to those who taught me Aquinas. Aquinas raises a really interesting point in our conversation that has become known as the should-ought conundrum. What should I choose to do, and how should I choose, or how should I make ethical choices? And does that understanding of what I should choose to do lead to how I ought to act? In other words, if I know what I should do, is that what I ought to do, or perhaps must do? The should-ought conundrum. Because often, and the most common one you hear is the naughty school child. You knew what you should do, yes. Why didn't you do it? Well, because. And the because can range from a naughty answer to a very sensible answer. You know, fill the gap with whatever you please. What Aquinas is trying to lead us to think about is how our knowledge and understanding of the world lead us to understand what we should do, and then lead to, or might lead to, our behavior, namely what we ought to do. The importance of Aquinas is that he is a philosopher who is also a theologian, and so a belief in the afterlife, a belief in God, is what we would call axiomatic. In other words, it's taken for granted. It's taken for granted by him, unlike, I mean, the ancient Greeks, of course, had different views on gods. They're pre-Christian. Others that will come in, you'll see, sit on various edges. For Aquinas, the existence of God is the very reason for life and living. God is the purpose of life. The afterlife explains the purpose of life. All of that is axiomatic in the sense that it just is. It's taken for granted. He doesn't need to discuss it at great length in this context.
Afterlife explains the.
Afterlife helps to explain the here and now. It helps to explain the meaning and purpose of life. Or it gives meaning and purpose to life, if you like. So ethics in that context is what leads us as individuals into a flourishing community. This is what we were talking about earlier. Is it about me and my values? Is it about the one child on the track or the 5 workers on the track? And Aquinas goes, ethics, we each run these things individually in our heads, but the goal has to be the flourishing community. And the goal of the community is life under God. It's the link, you know. So Aquinas does lots and lots of work about linking nature and the divine. and almost sets it up. And he brings in, on top of the should ought thing, he brings in another one about human freedom and self-determination. And he argues that it is only if we are totally, completely free beings that we are fully human. So without being free and without having self-determination, we are not fully human. Hear the echo of St. Paul. I did tell you I'd bring him in. Freedom is most visible in our freedom of choice and is key to ethics and ethical living. Even if there's some things we're not free to choose in practice, we still have the freedom of choice in principle and across many of those things. And the freedom of thought is underpinned by our ability to think. And that's what differentiates us as humans from the rest of nature. And that's what leads to self-determination. And it's what leads to the responsibilities we hold vis-a-vis ourselves, each other, God, the world, and so forth. But he then comes up with some interesting discussions. For example, just because I understand what ought to be right or what should be right does not necessarily mean that it is right. Understanding doesn't make it so. And it doesn't mean that I will necessarily do what is right. Just because I understand something doesn't mean I do it. The naughty school child is a flippant example. But we can think of more serious examples. And he also adds the idea of conscience. That we and he talks about some length that we have a conscience and we need to listen to and follow our conscience in what we do. So, let's try out, even though I've been very superficial, a little bit of Aquinas. If, coming back to our nuclear submarine, if you could take any action at all, whether it's reasonable or unreasonable, what would you do?
Stop. And then that tells me what to do.
To whether you commit a positive action like stopping something, or you elect not to make a decision, does that make you still responsible for the outcome? Presumably, if you've got the ability to stop it, you are charged with taking that responsibility, otherwise you can be there. That must be your duty, yes, your training, your obligation to your employer.
That's the speculative stuff. I haven't said it is, you could be there by happenstance. But we'll get to duties and things in a little while. What does your conscience say you should do? I'm just consider to do something. Well, your conscience says should.
Shut the nuclear power down.
Shut it down.
Not sure that's my conscience.
Wasn't, but you can invent an option.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not fair.
I destroy the sun, and my conscience tells me to destroy it.
Yes, I have the same answer.
So this is kind of the direction Aquinas is prodding us to think in. And then I'm going to take a little skip to Immanuel Kant.
I keep thinking of Monty Python's these days, guys.
Yeah, well, actually, Monty Python, of course, were all I think, Cambridge or Oxford educated. They had all read PPE or something like that. They are very, very, very smart men.
Yes.
It's like, name's gone, the guitarist in the band Queen.
Oh, no, right.
Yeah, who actually has a PhD in astrophysics on the side. Yeah, some of these people are incredibly smart people and really interesting to listen to. I'm sorry, I haven't written down the dates for Immanuel Kant and I can't remember. He is, of course, a really important Western philosopher. Was a German and he wrote like Germans, I can say that. Voluminously. He's not an easy read, but he's a really important read. Especially in ethics. He had a large focus on ethics. And a lot of his focus was about how we think about ethics and ethical values, what our thinking routines are, how we formulate our understanding of the world. And at the same time, he thinks about what limitations there are, influenced, I think, by people like Descartes. Descartes, of course, comes up with that lovely quip, I think, therefore I am. If you trace it back, I think, therefore I am for Descartes comes because he sat down and he said, okay, what do I absolutely know about the world? I know nothing. But if I know nothing and I can know nothing, then we're all little lost souls. So what is there that I can be certain about? Well, he says, I can doubt everything except the fact that I'm doubting. Because if I'm doubting, I'm thinking. There's a thought in my head that I'm doubting. Therefore, I can't doubt that I'm doubting. Therefore, Descartes gets to I think, therefore I am. Once he has I doubt equals I think, that is who I am, I exist. And on the basis of that, he builds up his whole theory about the world and thinking and knowledge and so on. Kant kind of launches off some of that Descartes thought about what is it possible to think about. And he's one of the early ones to explore the notion that our experiences shape what we think and how we think. And experience shapes what's possible for us. So, nice example, I am not a Maori. Pretty obvious if you look at me, I think. I have not a clue what it's like to be one. The experience of being in a different culture shapes your thinking. If you've ever learned another language, try translating a joke from one language. The really good jokes, the really funny ones, are just often not possible to translate. There's a wonderful prank that German kids play. I can't translate it. It's side-splittingly funny, but because it's dependent on a little play on words, I'd sit here for 15 minutes explaining the play on words, and because I've just spoiled the point of the joke. Kant understood language and experience, and that these shape how we think. But he adds to it and he says a fundamental requirement of our thinking is consistency. You can't just say, oh, my experience shapes and my inner world. You actually have to have a consistency of thinking, but that's not just about logic, it's about something far wider. And he writes at length about the notion of consistency and develops it into a duty-based ethics. So he kind of solves, if you like, the should-ought conundrum by saying we all have duties. And it's fairly simple. And it's not. By virtue of being born, others have a duty towards me. They have a duty to feed me, to clothe me, to keep me reasonably clean, to keep me out of the elements, various things. They have a duty to enable me to grow as a normal functioning member of society. By having that duty towards me, they also have responsibilities through which they exercise that duty or those duties. But of course, every duty that's held towards me, even as an infant, eventually I have reciprocating duties to others. These are shared things. We don't exist by ourselves. We exist connected, and Kant believes we're connected through the notion of duty and responsibility. It's a bit Germanic in some ways, but it works.
That would be a good argument for the care of the very frail elderly and those with severe dementia.
And the very young and the very ill and the incapacitated.
Except there's a value judgment about life.
But these are all exactly. They're all the practical examples that come where Kant's thinking is often applied. Even though his thinking is actually quite hard to grasp.
Is that like a social contract as well?
It's certainly been developed into that in some areas. But what Kant argues importantly is that whether our actions are good or not, whether they're right or not, is not based on the outcomes or the impacts of those actions. So most of our thinking about the submarine so far has been about the outcome or the impact of if I did this, then something would happen or not happen. Kant says that should not drive our ethical thinking. But he wants thinking to be based on what he calls motive. And it's this is not quite the same as motivation, but it is the motive that drives an action and gives it its ethical or moral status. And the motive arises out of reasoning. A little bit. And I don't want to dig too deep because it does get very complex very quickly, unless you're really interested in Kantian philosophy.
Could you just say that again? Motive arises out of
Reasoning.
You said with medicine, medical decisions in terms of procedures often is what's the best outcome we can get between the 20-year-old and the 80-year-old. Kant's not supporting this.
But what I will get to is the particular ethical constructs that are applied in those situations are actually, if I oversimplify it slightly, are a simplified version of Kant. In the same way that if you're familiar with physics at all, Newton is a really convenient simplification of Einstein. If you're a school student, you don't have to learn all of Einstein. If you get Newton, you'll pass your TE exams in physics.
Even if the question is about Einstein.
Well, if you understand Newton and the Newtonian calculations, you can do the basics at a sufficient level. Einstein much later, because it'll really walk in line. But Kant and utilitarian ethics are a little bit like that. That Kant is kind of, but except that Kant comes first. Kant is sort of the complicated, long-winded version. Utilitarian ethics we'll get to later is like the oversimplified applied version, but it's different again as well. I don't want to put it down. Because Kant raises a really important point that has become known as the categorical imperative. And here it is as a quote from him. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That's his English translation. Just take a moment to absorb that. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
How would you say it today in the 21st century?
Act in such a way that your actions could be applied universally as though they were always the principle or the rule. Okay, so last time we talked about the example of in the shop, what if you're given too much change? And, you know, we played it out with different amounts of money. The bit we didn't play out is what if you're standing at the till and you've got $5 too much? What if you've reached, you know, the doors to the shopping centre and you've got $5 too much? What if you've just sat in your car and you discover you've got $5 too much, or you've got home and you've got $5 too much? Is that going to make a difference to your decision, whether you give it back or not? What Kant would say is there is a principle, and the principle is about taking or not taking money that doesn't belong to you. And once you get that principle sorted, it shouldn't matter what the situation is, the principle will apply.
Whether it's $5 or $100.
Precisely, because the principle is about taking or not taking something that doesn't belong to you. So if we all say the principle is we do not take things that do not belong to us, then that should apply always in all situations.
Isn't that the basis of law and law?
Yep.
Our law.
Well, and ethics and law are at various points closely related, and at other points there's friction. So let me just keep pushing this one a little bit and amuse your minds, I hope. Kant would agree with Aquinas that to be this kind of person, we need to be free, independent beings. We need to have the freedom to make choices. The freedom to reason through our choices, so to think through them, and the freedom to accept the consequences of our actions. Without freedom, we can't reason. We would be robots with no independent free will, and if we had no independent free will, ethics would be pointless. Because robots don't need ethics. Except that I think with the application of the trolley problem to autonomous vehicles, I suggested to you maybe that robots actually do need ethics, but it becomes built into the design of the robot. But then the robot is making effectively ethical decisions as it drives that are predetermined. And what happens when a more sophisticated version of ChatGPT gets built into an autonomous vehicle and starts making live decisions? It is this autonomous intelligence that people are talking about at the moment. Sort of a hyper sophisticated version of Ask Google that will put material together. ChatGPT is a piece of AI software that's owned by Microsoft. Google has a version called Bard, which Google launched in the last few days, and has just cost them, if I read the media correctly, something like $110 billion in losses, because Bard got one answer to a question wrong. and Google prides itself on accuracy. Microsoft are not so worried about the accuracy, but they've got the bigger tool at the moment. AI, this stuff in AI is one of the next big frontiers. Watch out for it, it's coming. So a friend of mine in the university scenario has been in and tested ChatGPT and asked it to respond to a first year student essay question. And he says ChatGPT within seconds will produce a reasonable first year university essay that you might not always be able to tell if it was done on AI. Yep. The WA Department of Education has banned ChatGPT and similar technologies and required that they be excluded from all school computers. Of course, you can't exclude them from people's homes. They'll still be used. You know, what's going to happen with these tools is one of the big technology horizons and ethical questions at the moment. Told you I'd draw my examples over the media. So Kant, let's go back to Paul Kant, free will. And this idea of duties and responsibilities, universalizable principles, you know, honesty is a universalizable principle. And by virtue of being ethical beings, we have duties to ourselves, each other, and the world around us. And we're responsible. Okay. So let's put Kant to the test. Imagine I want to borrow some tools from my neighbor. So I tootle over to my neighbor and I say, hi, Greg, could you please lend me whatever the tools are that I want? I promise to return them next week. What Greg doesn't know is I've got my fingers crossed behind my back and secretly I'm promising not to return them because he's got far better tools than I have.
We're contemplating stealing.
Kant would say it's a false promise. Stealing, it's always wrong. Let's pursue though the irony. If we were to apply my action universally, so if we pretended I'm a Kantian and we apply my action universally, so everybody goes around borrowing tools from their neighbors, and everybody, even though they promise to return them faithfully, secretly knows they will not return them. You actually run the ironic outcome of having a much fairer distribution of tools because everybody has exactly the tools they want and need. Right?
Except, once the spoke, people will stop learning the tools.
But imagine that I have the tools I need and we all have the tools we need. Yes, there's a practical outcome.
All of those tools will be abundant.
But I'm too poor. Whatever. But imagine that we all kept doing this and the tools just do the rounds and we would all always have the tools we needed. It doesn't make it ethical, is what Kant would argue. No.
Because they get broken and loved.
Look, I'm not going that deep. I'm allowing them to be perfect and shiny and. But you're right. But Kant would argue that the false promise itself is where the ethics breaks down. Even though the redistribution of tools would appear to be a good thing, just because the outcome is good doesn't make it ethical. Look, you don't ask me to make things work in practical terms. That bends my mind too much. I'm more a theoretician.
I must have phased out for a minute there. He's borrowed the tools.
Yep.
What, and he returns inferior ones, does he?
No, I'm saying, what I'm saying is, I'm going to my neighbour Greg.
Yeah,
I'm borrowing some tools.
yes.
And secretly, Even though I promise to return them secretly, I have this law, I won't return them. But if Greg also goes to his neighbour and borrows tools and does the same thing,
Oh, okay.
and every other neighbour in the chain does the same thing, then you end up with unethical behaviour, but a fairer distribution of tools, because everybody has the tools they want and need. And if we all keep doing that, we will always have the tools we want and need.
I belong to a society that says what's yours is mine, what mine yours. And there are actually Aboriginal,
Yep.
Indian groups
Mhm.
who live their culture in that way, and so we interfere with them.
And
So
then, of
how
course,
does that affect current?
I don't know that can't really even have thought about that sort of stuff. But you're right, it's important to think about those kinds of communities because they have, and this is where I framed some of my introductory comments last week, that those kinds of communities are not in the central framework of Western thinking. But it does not mean that their way of approaching ethics is any less ever. Sometimes it's more sophisticated. It's just, this happens to be our tradition, and it happens to be some of the jumping thinking that we do.
Which of the philosophers was most influential on the New Testament?
Upon the New Testament. Well, if you look at the dating, it's probably the Greeks. So St. Paul would have read Aristotle and and Plato and St. Paul would have read some of those and other ancients. So you can hear echoes of their thinking.
See, Jewish influence.
Yep. But what I want to do is just pursue Kant for a moment back with our nuclear submarine. What duties are there, if anybody, and who has duties towards who? And can we think about them as universalized?
Well, if you are there, presumably for a reason that you are part of the navy that controls submarine lines, so then duty. Probably have that duty set down to the navy's principles. So it might not be just your conscience.
Yep.
So there might be
Yeah, so some of these duties get thought about a long time in advance.
If you're a commander in the Navy, you will have taken an oath to the President or the Queen or someone of very high authority. You won't get to be in charge of one of those things if you're a naval seaman second class.
But of course, famously, there are a number of stories of people who, in a difficult situation, hesitated long enough not to push the red button for the situation to blow over. And there are a number of, you now go back to the sort of 1950s, 60s, 70s, there are a number of incidents, particularly between the USA and the USSR, that could potentially have become of a nuclear explosion variety, but did not, because the people who had the duty to push the button or do whatever hesitated long enough. Had it been a problem, their hesitation would have been self-destructive.
But here we've got a rogue submarine.
Yeah.
Nuclear missile.
Yeah, that's my story for you. So I'm thinking, what are the duties? Who do we have duties to?
But then not the answers,
King Charles.
There are lots of stories about that. So what are the duties here? in our submarine.
Duty to yourself and duty to the other people in that immediate environment.
Yep.
Let alone all the other people.
And anybody else who might get injured from the missile that's about to be. Are they universal duties?
The duty to self must come first. Or to come first.
Well, I don't know if it's, if, the duty to yourself means that you save yourself. That's not always the way things have gone in wartime, when people have sacrificed themselves to save the lives of others.
Then they carried out their duty to self by sacrificing themselves.
The sub is near the Chinese coast as opposed to the sub being in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The president of America is going to make a different choice.
Or it might depend where the missile could land. Yeah.
We did refuse to, because I wanted him to drive the train back up and head to do the prep instead. And, so he refused to go out. So I said, I'm not going out to 17.
Hmm.
And I did, I left the road and pretty wanted to go back over. And so he had to participate.
And of course, in the military, unlike in the railways, that could have much more serious consequences.
Yes.
With the current Ukraine and the Ukrainian situation in New Zealand, there's my son was in a lecture from someone who was in Ukraine working, and he came back and he said to the room that he wouldn't recommend anyone joining the military in New Zealand because of the type of warfare that is happening at the moment. There are things, it's just so different to how I think they, and if you have a son or a child of age to join the military, he would never.
Yeah, because it's become brutal with
Yes.
the ability of technology.
Yeah, technology, chemical components now and
Yeah.
that's
Okay, so let's not get too distracted by war, but we're thinking about duties, which leads us to utilitarianism. You'll be pleased, this is the last one I'm pursuing tonight. Okay, I've got two photos there. On the left is Jeremy Bentham. This is his preserved remains. There's a story that goes with him. Bentham lived 1748 to 1832. Left a very large bequest to the University of London. On one of the requirements of the bequest is that he or his remains be wheeled into the university's annual meeting every year.
What remains are there?
That's a photo of mummified remains.
Oh, how
Okay.
that is rather.
Okay, he was, but Bentham, he was a social reformer. Bentham was a philosopher and a parliamentarian and is responsible for anti-slavery legislation, anti-vivisection legislation, or what we would today call the forerunner of animal rights legislation, women's rights, and various things. And he had this idea that ethics is about doing good. He clearly read the Greeks doing good, picked up those ideas, and he developed it into a maxim of doing the greatest good for the greatest number. and believed that, and if you trace Bentham, he actually believed that ultimately you could whittle that down to a mathematical formulation almost, of you could calculate goodness. But it changes ethics, and this is why I say in kind of a little offhand way, don't take it too literally. Utilitarianism is a kind of a simplification of Kant, because it looks at the outcomes, it looks at the impact and says, is this good? Is it worthwhile? Are we achieving good? Which action creates the most good? But if you think about greatest good for greatest number, it's actually quite problematic. It's problematic, for example, to take one Bentham's own. Bentham was the author of anti-slavery legislation. But surely slaves are in the minority and the majority are benefiting from slavery. So greatest good for greatest number could ironically be used, if you pushed it a bit too literalistically, as an argument for slavery. It doesn't quite work, but Bentham was right. So he was right, and he achieved an enormous amount of good. And along comes, and this happened partly during Bentham's life of maximizing goodness in all circumstances. So he stopped focusing at some point on sheer numbers and started focusing on maximum good. But along comes later Peter Singer, who is on the other side there. Peter is an Australian philosopher working in the US these days. Just a wonderfully accessible person. He published a book in the late 70s or early 80s titled Practical Ethics, which even today is still a wonderful read, and many of his other things are worth reading. He was a professor at Monash University when I was doing some postgraduate work there. And part of Peter is he actually lives his principles. And unless it was absolutely raining, Melbourne rain, one lunchtime a week at least, you would find him sitting out the quadrangle and anybody could come and sit and talk to him and ask him questions. He's that kind of person. So he takes up this idea of utilitarianism, but focuses much more on maximizing goodness in all situations, and thinks about the consequences of action, balancing harms versus good, all these things, and all the things that Kant wrestled with, but in a much cleaner way. And Peter Singer has a lot of experience, and it's quite controversial with some of his stuff about infants, particularly if they're extremely ill. He's been misread by a lot of people, so please don't necessarily take as gospel some of the things people say about him, but actually read him if you're going to. So let me think about an example. Let's imagine that there is a terrorist group, and this terrorist group are going to fly an aeroplane, for the sake of the example, into the middle of Perth City and destroy a number of buildings. This will happen at a time unknown. It will happen unknown to everybody. It will just be out of the blue. Except that Australia has wonderful surveillance and authorities arrest a person who they suspect may be linked to this possible crime. Is it ever right to forcibly coerce or torture this suspect to obtain the information that may save the many innocent? Why?
As far as I know, torture has not been proven to be beneficial. you bring information.
Let's imagine that it could. Is it ever right to torture one to save many?
Torture this. That you rely on the information that you're being given.
And that's the question, I think. And what I'm saying is let's just assume, for the sake of argument at the moment, that you can in this case. Let's just assume it will lead to reliable information.
So you vacate the city and go torture.
Yeah, I'm not asking what else. I'm asking, is it ever right to torture?
That's what torture is.
Yes.
You can imagine anything under the name of torture.
Never right.
No, it's totally
Dehumanising
dehumanising.
You might sometimes do it.
Should or ought, yeah.
Mhm.
If it means saving lots of lives, I think we're taking any measures to do that.
Some might.
No,
That would be very
Otherwise, you'll
You've got
just
to
live with
remember
the
our
thought, I
genetics.
could have, but I didn't.
It's the same argument as the trolling test, that torture is actually leader in the trolling argument. So the conclusions we came to with that would, when we're guided to those conclusions, would guide us in this circumstance.
Are we being consistent? It's precisely what Kant and Aquinas and others have asked. Consistency. If I can put the question in another way, I think you've got it there, or my question at least. Is it ever permissible to harm or violate the rights or dignity of one individual in order to save or create a benefit for the many?
Sadly, no, if we're human beings in integrity, I don't think we can.
Because you do it once,
Never say
to
it.
do it again. So people who have their children murdered or something like that.
That's not the
Because
same.
you become
That's not quite the same, but you're right. You become who
that.
they are.
I would say I would, and I would say that I'm all that universal, but very much individual on circumstances.
But this is,
So I
this
sit
is
on one
defining
side of the fence,
consistency.
someone sits on the other, yes, it is consistent in that you're looking at each situation.
How is it consistent?
Because it's the greater good, saying the greater good, the citizens of Perth. As to the harm and the violation of one. And it's just, it's almost personal, isn't it? Boils down to that.
And I mean, I can say military ethicists spend on real-time wrestling this one because it's so difficult.
I'm sure the universal for them are sometimes want to
Mm.
you know, or how many numbers.
What are the courses of action? And it appears straightforward. Why I'm asking the question. But what are the courses of action you think that could be taken to deliver the greatest benefits and minimize the harms?
Well, one of the actions would be for this particular person who's been picked up. I want to put a psychologist, a priest, a philosopher in the room, an ethicist in the room, and have discussion with this individual to help tease out the motive.
if this person's just going to sit there and go,
Then you come to the end. Step one. That's an action I would take. Thinking about finding a way, it's not talking about using the internet. On the heart of that individual, treating life.
how do you reconcile that with Christian values? I'm not saying it can't be done, I'm just interested.
Reconcile which,
If you're prepared to go and step over the line, as you said, I'm assuming that means ultimately you would be prepared to torture somebody.
violate that person,
Yeah. How do you reconcile that with Christian values?
something I tend to take to my grave and to my neck.
Which kind of illustrates just how complex these ethical questions are. That's sometimes the only place we can take.
And what I want to save that many and sacrifice that.
What you could do is you could employ somebody to make that decision, who you know does not have Christian ethics background, and may very well say, yes, I will make this decision. I will torture, and, yeah,
So would you do what that person recommended? So you've employed an independent person, you're saying they're totally independent, and that person says around, okay, you can torture. Would you do it?
which I think would.
Because, and that's when it gets personal. Would I be prepared to do it, not just to rely on somebody else in the amorphous military or whatever to do it for me?
This fellow's going to die in the resulting explosion, wherever it is, anyway, isn't it? He's going to
I
die.
didn't say that, but you're adding that to the story.
Because everyone is going to die. This is in the middle of Perth.
Yeah, I'm just saying, take out a
the.
city block or something in that.
So,
This is why we have military games and pre-planning and other sorts of things, is they look at scenarios like this and say, that's why we need Patriot missiles established all the way around Perth, because this is a likelihood. I don't think that a moral question necessarily starts with the situation of the aircraft imminently coming to crash. It starts with how our society looks at our defence and our behaviours. We take a commitment not to torture people to get information. We have to take other action to protect ourselves.
And so I'm playing in part with the idea of, the one versus the many. And this is one of the difficulties for utilitarianism, as well as one of the areas where it helps us. If I turn the one versus many around a little bit now, we're still talking about one versus many. I'm now living in 1940s Europe. I'm harboring a Jewish person in my cellar. There is a knock on the door one day. Excuse me, sir, are you harboring a Jewish person in your cellar? Do I lie or tell the truth?
Check yourself in the family.
So I lie and I say no. Excuse me, may we come and look? If they find this person, they will shoot me.
And if you tell them the truth, that you are harboring.
shoot you anyway.
Or they'll shoot them, maybe not me. Let's just assume for the sake of this story, I'll get away with it, but the Jewish person won't. But if I'm caught lying, I won't get away with it.
There's movies that have done both scenarios. haven't they?
Mhm. Movies are a wonderful tool for thinking about ethics.
And sometimes that's the agreement to stuff I have come and grown lucky. I won't be lying to them, so the Jewish person can stay in the house for God is the best.
Yeah, it's how do you, but it's that tussle of one versus many. And if you live in a regime such as Nazi Europe or such as any one of those kind of regimes, if you are in the midst of it, the evil of it is not necessarily immediately apparent to it. It is the rare few who spot the evil in the first instance. It is only after it is too late that larger numbers spot the evil. So the one versus many really does become a real issue.
I would argue that many is open to analysis and debate, because you're looking at saving the one Jewish person or your family, but how did that situation come about? It came about because the society let it come about. But there's a society even outside that opposes that, even if they can't fight it. So the many could be that wider society, and upholding the principle would, in the end, be to the benefit of the wider society.
It pushes us to ask also a deeper question about what is greater, lesser harm or benefit. And this is, I think, where Bentham kind of got in and got muddled. He seemed to think there was a way of measuring harm and measuring benefit, and I don't think you can. I think you get a sense if something is really harmful or is less harmful, but you can't sort of take a ruler to it and measure it. This is where I think Peter Singer is right. Of once you have that guiding sense, you then apply the principles.
She talks about she did research. When people are in power, they look at the phone. People who grow up in London,
One possible explanation.
violence and child abuse goes on to institutions and how they can't.
But I mean, I think there's also a difference between people who lead institutions and others, and people who are inside institutions and focus on their own motivation. And a lot of, I suspect a lot of people in large institutions are motivated by their fortnightly paycheck. You know, I think sometimes it's as simple as that, and people will do what they're told because they're motivated by the need to pay their bills. You know, maybe I'm a cynic.
She's actually talking about structure.
Yeah. The structure of organisations is complex. And organisational ethics is the word that we have to work on.
Just want some clarity. You talked about seeing the true lie, true lie later, I think you said. And where the one versus many isn't always the right action. What you said?
Kind of. What I'm suggesting here is that we would all agree that lying is wrong. That's a principle. If we were Kantian, we would universalize that, we would not lie. We would quickly agree that lying when put next to subjecting the Jewish person we're harboring to a certain death, that the lie is the lesser evil and the greater good or the greater principle is protecting this person. And Kant would agree with that as well. Kant would have that problem. So that what Kant would say is, yes, there are universal principles, but you then kind of have this ranking of some are more important than others. And that ranking is framed by situations as much as it's framed by some actual sense. You know, so those things that preserve life fundamentally are more important than those things that are, you know, like the telling of a lie. Unless the telling of the lie is about preserving life, in which case it becomes important in order to preserve life.
Does that mean that it starts at the core of
Ethics is infused from the start all the way through.
It's never a white lie, is it? Situation. Call it a white lie. It has to start with the situation.
Usually, yes, that's where we wrestle with it
You
in
can't have
practice.
that in how.
Context is different and decision making might be different, but that does not necessarily mean the principles are different.
Getting back to the knock on the door and the person protecting the judgment. If the house owner were confident that the Jewish man was able to hide himself really well, now that would make a difference to whether he said yes or whether he said no, which comes back to which is the ethical answer.
And
on
who are you protecting, and who do you owe the duty to, and is your duty to self higher than duty to others? And of course, we talk about all those great heroism stories. You know, somebody jumps in the surf, knowing there's a risk to themselves in order to try and save another person. And sometimes it goes well, and sometimes it doesn't.
And I think in those situations, it's instinctive, and people probably don't say, "No, wait a minute. It's quite possible that I won't make." You know, I think it's so instinctive, especially if it's a family member.
It is, but if it's a family member because of our relationship to them, but in a professional context like nursing or palliative care, these things are drilled into us from experience, from others, from learning. I think one of the most obvious examples in some ways is people like airline pilots who are just drilled with every possible emergency that can be thought about, so that in the event it were ever to happen, they would react instinctively. From what I know about aircraft, it's quite likely those two guys who walked away from the tanker that came out of the sky in Fitzgerald River National Park the other day actually walked away because of their instinctive reactions, because they were so well drilled in stall emergencies that they knew what they did it instinctively. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of the inquiry, whether I'm right or not.
I have a pilot's license, pilot's license, and yes, everything is. I'm a doctor, and one of the major improvements in medicine has come from taking what they call cognitive resource management, what an airline to medicine. One of those ideas is that we have a system of checklists. So if there's an emergency, you just find out the checklist for that emergency. You write engine fails, you get out that checklist and you just run through it. And one pilot goes running through it and the other pilot carries out the action. So that fact that you're going to have to make a decision apart from pick up the check.
which works in an aircraft,
Yes,
but doesn't always work in a person because people
doesn't
people are
always,
more complex.
people are more complex. And
But it covers the basics for, you know, I mean, without being flippant, for the burst appendix or the broken arm or the,
yes,
you know, the clear cut accident. These are the things you actually need to make sure you've thought
Yes.
about. And in fact, in my last job, I spent hours developing safety style checklists for researchers in using precisely that model. You know, that it doesn't matter whether you're flying a drone, walking into a laboratory, doing, you know, to do the task ethically, you also need to be doing it safely. So let's deal with the safety, and which is not your OSH stuff, is your basic approach stuff, because doing it safely is one of the steps to doing it ethically. Don't get me on the
Two
whole.
helicopters crashed, it was just.
Easily. And the reason it can happen easily is because if you've ever watched what they do, I've been to SeaWorld, but not watched that, but I've been in Cairns and watched a similar thing. These are 5 to 10 minute joy flights. They're quick, they're up and down. And so you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever number of helicopters going up, down, up, down, up, down all day and doing a predefined route.
Say no more, that in itself. It's a
And
very dangerous schedule.
yep. So what I'm saying is the schedule is dangerous. The throughput of people to make money is dangerous. And despite every safety precaution in the world that pilots might take, it only takes a strong gust of wind or a misalignment of direction. If one pilot or other loses, say to bright sun or whatever, their immediate sense of direction by 50 meters. And in that kind of tight circle, you're done for. So if you go different experience again, we last year went up Gig River Road, we did the little helicopter across the Mitchell Falls. And what intrigued me about that is they sit there and one helicopter goes and the next one does not move until the one has landed.
Yes, I've done the same.
Yeah, and I went, okay, I can see where they're getting their safety.
okay, I'll get on that helicopter, but I won't do.
That's why I
Why
do
don't
the joy
you-
flight in Cairns.
Yes.
So we can't wait for us to make money.
Safety comes first.
But
So, yeah.
The one at the Mitchell Falls cost me a lot more. And then my question is my life worth the extra $100? Ironically, if you look at the airline industry as a whole, many people are prepared to bet their lives for $100. Many people will go with or most of us will go with the cheapest ticket rather than the most dependable airline. And what we will do is we will trust, for example, in Australia, that CASA regulations are such that airline travel is safe, which broadly in Australia it is. But that does not mean it is necessarily the case in every other country.
We're just now being outsourced in some domains. We're just, use the shelter.
Anyway, back to utilitarianism, if I may. So we're thinking about greater and lesser goods and harms, costs, considering the consequences of our actions and the cost of our actions. And sometimes consequences are not easy to predict. Who in the 1930s or 40s or 50s would have predicted the consequences of long-term smoking? Not many. Asbestos, slightly different story, and we can come up with a few other examples. So it's about getting the best information we can and thinking about how to maximize good, how to maximize ethical outcomes. And of course, utilitarianism is commonly used in the medical world because it's such a useful set of tools that you can actually whittle it down to almost checklist kinds of things about, not quite, but almost in that kind of way. How do we maximize the goodness? You know, have we thought about everybody and all the relevant things in this scenario, this situation? So I won't stop and think now about our submarines and maximizing goodness. I want to just touch base, say there are a lot of other approaches to ethics. I'm just not covering them all. Well, all of these approaches to ethics would have something to say about money. I'll leave you with Martin Luther. Go back to the Middle Ages. Well, not quite. 2 quotes from him. I know I've taken them out of context, but they're here to get you to think. I love that notion. Love God and do what you will. That gets you to think. Because if you love God, then what you will, what you choose by your free will is framed by your love of God. So your thinking is immediately altered. But then elsewhere he says, be a sinner and sin bold. Oh, I love that. Thank you, Luther. Now, we're in wind-up point, and so we won't do the last exercise, but I'll give it to you as a thinking exercise. You can take it home. And what I was going to do, if we had time, is use this set of questions, particularly focusing on the inquiry questions, the ones that are hardest, around that text. And if you're not familiar with that text, well, now, what would our serious inquiry questions be about that?
So the second one, oh. Yes.
Yeah,
Oh, it's great.
yeah.
Sure.
Now, next week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an introduction essentially on professional ethics or ethics in professional contexts. It's borrowed from my friend Stefan Millet. You'll see how that fits together. And then I've got, I think currently about 20 different little scenarios, vignettes, stories. If you would like to contribute a story, please feel free. Here's your opportunity. You can send it to me, I'll add it to the PowerPoints, you can bring it to the class, we can discuss it. I'm happy to put most of mine aside. But what I'm wanting to try and do is run, and you'll see I've got a bit of a bias towards things that involve technology and data and some medical stuff and a few others. Almost all of mine are drawn out of reasonably recent news media. So I'm talking about the last 4 years or so. They're all real stories in one fashion or another. And they are there to generate this kind of conversation. So now that we've done a bit of trail through the really hard stuff, what I want to do next week is, if you like, the fun stuff. Let's actually do some finger poking at people and organizations and ethical slip-ups and all that. So that's next week. And then the 2 after that are where we get much more bogged down into death and dying stuff. And the 2 bits, and once I get somebody to help from here to help me, I'll copy some articles for you as a pre-read for those. So working our way through the abortion debates or pregnancy termination debates and the voluntary euthanasia debates. really as a way of grappling in depth with two things. And I could have chosen a myriad of other things, but I figured fundamental life and death questions are important to us as Christians. And that's something that we can sit and just get our teeth into in much more depth and be a little less superficial than I have here. So I hope I'm a little bit better than the evening with alternate entertainments. I think you're becoming and putting up with me. And need to have any fun, but if you wish to contribute something for next week, please feel free either to
Yeah,
send it
it's,
through.
it's a hypothetical or it's a situation that we've.
It can be anything. All I'm doing is drawing, I've got this whole catalogue of stuff I found that are sometimes short, sometimes long, taken out of the media. I've got a researchy one, you know, I've got one of the Nazi concentration camp examples. I've got a whole lot of stories that are just designed to get us thinking a bit more about applying these ideas and methods.
Do you want us to come back with some answers?
Yeah, come back with some questions.
That's fine.
And if we get some time, we'll share them and have some fun. So we'll see how much time we have. And if we don't, well, you can always put the questions on the Moodle bulletin board or somewhere and start a conversation. I just haven't had time this year to get into the Moodle stuff, but there's enormous opportunity for us to have conversations between classes and all sorts of stuff. It's entertaining enough. Yeah, there's some really pragmatic, like I've got to live as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, and drive safely home.
Oh, I intend to, thank you.
If you're going to have a class on the 30th of March.
Yeah, whenever they're scheduled.
Yeah, it's 4 weeks after the other one's finished.
Yeah, and I apologize for that odd date. The reason for the odd date is because before I was invited to come here and do this, I had already committed to go to my grandson's second birthday in Adelaide and had the flights booked and everything. And then
Absolute priority as a grandmother.
you get it.
I won't be able to come to that, but I'll try to catch it. If I can. Technology is beyond.